Hello, Cassidy here, and I am back to talk about more Peterson. So in my last monologue video, I did a part 1 of Peterson, and it has actually been a long time coming for the second video, so I appreciate your patience. Hopefully the second part was worth the wait, but finally strong enough to sit down and record and get this out to you, so I'm happy to do that. So in part 1, if you haven't seen it, link below if you want to watch it, but basically what I did is I looked at some of the early viral moments of Peterson, sort of his rise to fame, and tried to pull out pieces in those bigger moments of what Peterson is doing to affect Estuary movement and the broader things that are happening in what some may call this little corner of the internet. And today I want to keep doing that, but I want to look at that in the frame of this growing tension with Peterson as he engages with the political, comparing that with some of his non-political work, maybe his less known, less viral clips, and how those things interact with Estuary and what that can mean for whatever this little movement is. So the name Jordan Peterson comes with a lot of implications. I think many people hear it and they think politics, culture war, or engaging in conversations that could be deemed problematic. And if you look at some of the clips that I shared in the first half, you very much see that pattern of what Peterson has presented in the public. And I started there because for me, that was my exposure and my experience to Peterson and how I saw him and got introduced to him. During the time of Peterson's rise to fame, I was fairly intrigued by this whole culture war movement. And I want to be clear, my intrigue was not necessarily stemming from a full support and embrace of it, because then and even now I have some reservations and mixed feelings about the whole movements and whatever you want to call that. But I was drawn into it because I understood where it was coming from. Last 10 years, I have lived and worked in very progressive cities and industries. I went to San Francisco State University after living a life in a very conservative Christian environment. And so I got to experience firsthand, and often secondhand, these tensions that came with discussing politics and religion and some of these bigger questions. So I understood the frustration of these sort of straw man versions of conservatism, or even sort of a demonization of identifying with conservative, where if you had a more conservative belief, there was a tendency to not engage well with that conversation and label any of those beliefs under some sort of phobic category. And to me, there was just so much more nuance needed in these conversations, and I didn't like that tension. So seeing something that was trying to counter this other sort of more left narrative that was very present in universities was interesting. The problem was that often when you saw these counters come out, you're immediately exposing yourself to a reactionary mode of being, because there's already a tension here. And so, the minute you try to step in and create some sort of alternative narrative, there's already going to be sort of that outrage and that sort of emotional response attached to those things. And what I saw happening was that often in that process to create that counter narrative or give a different side to the conversation, it began to mirror back the sort of antagonistic spirit that was not something I found helpful on the other side of the aisle. And so you had basically two groups of people with different ideas, different frameworks or beliefs coming at the conversation with the same spirit. And it allowed for a dialogue, but I wasn't sure how healthy or productive it was. And I don't know how much I trusted, in the long term, that sort of exposure was going to bring healthy, nuanced conversation. It seemed to bring in more of this them against us mentality where I fight to win no matter what, and, replace this narrative with something more true that I've already found. And I just thought there's more nuance needed, and probably a lot of this could be done in a healthier manner. Now, I don't really want to go too deep into a breakdown of culture war stuff because that's a whole different topic, a whole different video. But it isn't something I can completely ignore because Peterson, in many ways, has been branded as this culture war figure. From the minute he stepped out to talk about the political things that were happening to him and affecting him and the people he was working with, probably not recognizing what that was going to do for his family, his career, and all of these things, it opened him up to that perception, and it's sort of grown the more that he has participated in the political. And at this point, I think maybe he would even identify in some ways himself with that, particularly given some of his more recent choices in his career and in his public personality. But as I mentioned in the last video, when I was watching Peterson, especially sort of these early viral moments, there was something distinctly different about what he was doing versus what I was seeing in other places in the culture war. He didn't seem to take on that reactionary spirit as much. There wasn't so much of a destroying mentality, more an engaging and a curiosity and an unwillingness to bend to something he believed and thought of for the sake of the conversation. And so it felt like he was maybe dancing with the line of culture war, or at the very least speaking with them on similar conversations, but there wasn't this full embrace of that. The other part of this too is, while he was getting a lot of exposure for the political things that he was doing, there's this whole other part of Peterson that didn't really have anything to do with the political. And I didn't recognize this until I spent more time in estuary circles and talking with people who've been really impacted by the work that he's done and the thing he's created. Many were interested in sort of Maps of Meaning, the biblical series, even 12 Rules for Life, which in my sense are not so politically driven. And while I do think that politics has become more a part of his work the longer he's created publicly, I don't think that is the crux of what drew people into him, and especially his early fans, what was keeping them coming back and listening to what Jordan Peterson had to say. But because he got so much exposure for that, it drew this tension into the conversation and the way that Peterson operated publicly. And it felt like this tension grew over time. It was something I think Peterson wrestled with himself. I remember in the Vice interview talking about how he felt fragmented. And I think over time you could start to see that fragmentation in him grow and grow the more exposure he got. And I remember the first time seeing this in the GQ interview. And if they let me play it, I want to play a little intro clip there to get a sense of that tension, to see it for yourself.
How much responsibility do you feel that you have, particularly guys, the alt-right, who, as you say, some of them have enjoyed your work and say,
No,
I'm not one of you guys. I'm not with you guys.
They haven't enjoyed my work.
I've definitely read bits on the internet.
Read more.
Okay, so obviously this conversation is a long one. It has its ups and its downs, but you can sort of see from that little brief clip there is sort of a tension and sort of a posture of frustration that Peterson shows even from the get-go. And obviously they edited that clip in. So is that how the whole conversation started? I don't know. But overall throughout it, there were definitely moments where he had this more defensive posture. And you felt the tension between the two parties. And, like the pattern in the last video, Peterson was not shy to talk about this experience on the Joe Rogan podcast. So before I get more into this, let's look a little more into the background of what was going on in this situation and sort of get some context from Peterson himself of, what is happening here.
I've said this many times, and I just had a conversation with my good friend Steve Ranella the other day where he brought it up independently. He said, I think Jordan Peterson is the most misunderstood and misinterpreted guy in the world. He's like, people are always like, not just misinterpreting, but misstating what you believe in, misstating what you say. this opposition to you, this, I mean, like we were talking about this GQ interview, which I thought was, I thought that woman was far more intelligent than and her approach was far better and far more reasoned and well thought out than some of the other attacks on you before. So they're bringing in the varsity level players is what I'm saying. It's like, but I think this is important. I think this is part of what forges this message is that you are, and and this is one of the things that Eric Weinstein and I had said about you, is that you're essentially the Hoist Gracie of the intellectual dark web. If you don't know what that means, is the early days of the UFC, no one knew what the best martial art was. And the idea was like, there was all these martial arts that are running around independently, and they were all claiming that they had the best technique, and let's see what happens. And Hoist Gracie was the one who represented jiu-jitsu and went out there and beat all these people with superior technique and superior strategy.
South American?
Yes, he's from Brazil.
Brazil, yeah, okay. I know about him, yeah.
And he launched this Brazilian, and his family launched this Brazilian jiu-jitsu empire that has since taken over the world of martial arts. But you are the one who's consistently engaging in these people. You're the one who's involved in these Vale Tudo events where you're debating these people who are coming at you hostile with notes. And I think as uncomfortable as those moments are, like, who was the woman that said, so what you're trying to say is...
Yeah, Kathy Newman.
Yeah, I think her approach... I think she misunderestimated you. I think she underestimated you. I think she misinterpreted who you are, and she thought that she could come at you with this straw man sort of article and argument rather, and frame your positions in a very unflattering way. It just didn't work.
No.
It was like the early days of Hoist Gracie. Guys would come at him flailing, and he'd get him in an arm bar, and they'd tap out, and they'd go, fuck. That's kind of what happened with you. But now this woman who you had this conversation with in GQ, she was much more skilled.
Yeah.
She was better verbally.
Yeah.
Her arguments made more sense.
Yeah.
She seemed more reasonable, more well-read.
Yeah.
She was able to think on her feet quicker. But still, these are really important conversations.
Well,
So let's stop there for a second. I find it really interesting the way that Joe Rogan talks about Peterson in the frame of conversation with UFC and fighting. Now, I'm always a little bit weary of framing these types of conversations in sort of fighting language. But for Joe, it's sort of interesting because, martial arts and UFC, these are things that are not war. They're a practice. They're a participation and a form of play for him. So to map that onto what Jordan Peterson is doing here is not this call to action for a them against us mentality. It's more of a recognition of what is happening as we try to enjoy this form of play that is conversation. And I think what he's pointing out here was the thing that I was starting to see, that when Peterson was in these conversations and operating at his best, he was changing the game in contentious conversation. So when you're talking about controversial ideas or deeply held belief, there's always this room for contentiousness to come out. And, we're asking the question, what practices or rules can we utilize to help keep the conversation going? How are we able to build trust with the person that we're talking to, especially if we have different beliefs, to gain that understanding and see things from a different perspective? We're all kind of trying to figure that out, and Peterson is one of these people we're watching to do that. The people are trying to take him down, and it wasn't working. And even sometimes it was decreasing the tension. So seeing him struggle in that conversation, was noted by his fans and the people who were watching. And I think, even Peterson himself, which he addresses here in this next part of the video.
Well, it was a funny day because I went to the hotel room in Baltimore, and I went out of my way to do it. And she was hostile to me the second I walked into the room.
Really?
Yes, and that really kind of put me off.
How so?
Well, she basically told me that we were going to have a war, not so many words, but just there was a coldness to her and a distaste for me that was sort of radiating from her. So she was animus possessed from a Jungian perspective. That's the right way of thinking about it. One of the ways of thinking about that is that she had a chip on her shoulder in relationship to me. So she'd already formulated who I was in her imagination. Right. And it was also maybe a form of projection. So like I was the embodiment of all the things that she found distasteful. And that's who she was. So there was no there was no willingness to consider on her part that I could be different than her preconceptions of
Yes.
me, right? And so she was hostile to me in the way that you would be if you were prejudiced against someone right from the beginning. And so by the time it was uncomfortable in the room, and by the time and there was a photo shoot, and so by the time the conversation started, I was more impatient than I would normally be, because one of the things that I do expect from journalists, and Kathy Newman was like this, by the way, and so have some of the other people that have gone after me, at least they had the professionalism to be civil before the interview started.
Right.
You know, like because there's a
Right.
certain amount of politeness, I would say, that not that I'm owed, but that someone you're interviewing is owed
Yes.
if they come out of their way to go talk to you. It's
Well,
like,
it's just human decency.
Yes,
there's no real conflict, right? Until you have this conflict, it's just hello, nice to meet you.
Yeah, thank you
just
for coming.
Two human beings interacting with each other.
yes,
Yeah.
on relatively
Socially,
professional,
yes.
well, even just professional, right?
Right.
Even just professional grounds. It's like,
Yes.
well, we're both here to do a job, and I've agreed to come, but no, there was palpable enmity in the air right to begin with.
So when I'm looking at these viral moments, I actually really like to look at them in regards to human dynamics, because often the differences in ideas is not really what I think is creating the contention, although that certainly makes things more untenable. But it's really more about how we perceive each other and how we choose to communicate that. And that can be the biggest factor in all of this. And here again, watching Peterson talk about the relational difficulties was interesting. Recognizing that his perception of the situation affected his behavior. And I think a little bit down the line, he talks about how he might be losing patience to have productive interviews like this. You know, in my mind, sort of fair enough. I mean, fame is such a weird thing, especially if it comes from the get-go shrouded in controversy. And I just don't think any of us can really understand what that's like. Maybe unless you've been through an experience similar, but even then, each situation is so different. I just can't imagine what it would be like to have the pressure and exposure Peterson has gotten, and so aggressively and so quickly. And I guess I can give him grace in the way that he handles himself in some of these exchanges. I think there's probably a healthy dose of grace we should provide anybody in a similar situation, independent of where they lie on the aisle. At the end of the day, he's still human, and as much as someone watching can look and, you know, posture that they could do it better or they'd be unfazed by the pressure, I think that's really hard to know. And I have some sympathy for what seems to be this tension that is within Peterson himself. I also don't think most people understand the reality of what can happen when you wade into anything that might be construed as political. Through my work in several different fields, I've had the chance to talk with a lot of people who they don't have public presence, but they went through similar patterns of speaking out on something that was affecting their community, trying to help the conversation. And what resulted was attempts to hurt someone's livelihood or their good standing in the community. And that all has some really unfortunate unintended consequences. It just doesn't surprise me that the tension and distress that we see present here for Peterson in this interview and in other places throughout his career has manifested for someone in his situation. That said, I also have some uncertainty about the helpfulness of the more aggressive attitude and have a bit of sympathy for someone like Helen Lewis in this position. We've gotten to hear Peterson's perspective of what happened, but there's always two sides to a story, and I haven't really found Helen Lewis's perspective of what happened that day and how she perceived things. But I don't think it's ever easy to encounter a situation and interview someone who has their guard up, is very defensive, especially if you do have challenges or misaligned beliefs with somebody else. And so, I don't know, I just wonder, could things have gone differently if this had happened at a different time in Peterson's career, maybe earlier in his rise to fame? Could there have been minimized assumptions and negative participation from both parties going into this conversation that would create more trust and have a better conversation. I mean, there's a possibility. But overall, I think what the conversation showed was this lack of trust with both parties and how that made things a bit rocky. But it was interesting to sit back and listen to Peterson question himself and ask if this was something he should be still doing. I'll try to play that clip here.
At the end of that interview, I thought, geez, maybe I've done enough interviews, because I found that I was more impatient than I would have liked to have been. Now, luckily, it doesn't seem to have gone overboard, because I've been watching the comments on that GQ interview, and I think it's got about 4.5 million views, some ridiculous number of views. And people have said that I was more impatient and a little harsher than usual, which I think is true. And I thought, God, maybe I'm starting to run out of patience, which isn't good, right?
Right.
I don't want to run out of patience.
Because then it will flavor the message that you're putting out there.
Definitely.
And people will take it in the wrong way, and they'll take it in with that bitterness.
Yes, exactly. Well, and one of the things that I think is very important is that you don't become resentful.
So there may have been interviews after this GQ interview, but there was a chunk of time after this aired that Peterson did sort of disappear and stop doing interviews. Given some of his health concerns with himself and his family, he just didn't have the ability to participate, but eventually was able to come back. And a lot of his fans were really excited about this. But as he came back, the pushback and criticism returned. But this time, it wasn't much about his interviews or the work he had produced, but instead a depiction of him in a fictional work. So Marvel made this Captain America comic that featured their Red Skull character, who, as Peterson likes to call him, is depicted as a magical super Nazi. In this rendition, he's seen as a internet guru type person that was attracting young men, bringing them in, telling them they have purpose and meaning, and basically indoctrinating them with dangerous ideas and telling them that they needed to fight the system. There were references to a work by this Red Skull figure for 10 Rules for Life and talking about order and chaos, which are very close to the things that Peterson talks about. And not close, they are the things that Peterson talks about. So very quickly, people started to suggest that this might be drawing inspiration from Peterson. And Peterson agreed and talked publicly about how shocked he was about that. Now, this sort of controversy is almost more tricky to maneuver for a couple of reasons. One, he's not directly in it. This is a inference, a satire, a caricature of him and his work. He had nothing to do with the actual creation of this thing, but because this character was made, it draws these parallels to what he's put out, and it changes the perception of how people see him and his work. Second, it's coming from a fictional form, and a lot of people would say, oh, well then, that doesn't really matter, it makes it less credible. But what we do when we consume fiction is often consume those things with our guards more down, and we don't think as critically as with the things that we're consuming when we're looking in that frame. And so all of a sudden you're getting exposure, and there's this parallel of you being put into an audience of people who maybe have never heard of you before, have no idea what your work actually is, but are being introduced to that with this sort of villainous figure attached to it. It does create connections in our brain, without us even recognizing it if we're not being intentional enough with how we're consuming. Now, I don't think that anyone would deny that this pattern being showcased in this comic can happen. I mean, young people go, they're lost, they go to the internet, they try to find answers, they come across some creator that gives them weird or, maybe even dangerous ideas. And I think Peterson himself would see that pattern, as he's been credited for pulling people out of alt-right patterns and alignment, or even sort of incel lifestyles. But I think the question that's left with this, and probably the question we should be asking when we're consuming satire is this comparison and parallel accurate? And in this particular case, does this represent Peterson and his ideas? And I think to get the best understanding of that, you have to go and look at Peterson's direct work. But I think more specifically in Peterson's case, you have to get down to some of the things that aren't so political, the things that don't get as much traction within the normal media narrative. And to start that little journey, I actually went to Jordan's YouTube page to see his video catalog. And a lot of his recent work is conversations, many surrounding the political things that he's involved in and political things that his guests are involved in. But when I went through his most popular videos, the top result was this first episode of his biblical series. Now, this is a 2+ hour video of Peterson and talking about biblical stories and psychology and his musings of all of those things. And I'm sure many of you have watched the whole thing, so I don't want to go through and play too much of it. But when I started playing this, I was struck by the intro of the lecture. One, because I think it shows us a different side of Peterson than when he's in sort of these manufactured internet moments in a scenario that he is more comfortable with, that he has more control of and curation of. But two, it shows how Peterson chooses to orient himself in those spaces where it's not as high intensity or controversial. So I want to play that right now.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's really shocking to me that you don't have anything better to do on a Tuesday night. No, seriously though, it is. I mean, it's very strange in some sense that there's so many of you here to listen to a sequence of lectures on the psychological significance of the biblical stories. It isn't something I've wanted to do for a long time, but it still does surprise me that there's a ready audience for it. And well, so that's good. So we'll see how it goes. And I'll start with this, because this is the right question. The right question is, why bother doing this? And I don't mean, why should I bother doing it? I have my own reasons for doing it, but you might think, well, why bother with this strange old book at all? And that's a good question, It's a contradictory document that's been cobbled together over thousands of years. It's outlasted kingdoms, many, many kingdoms. It's really interesting that it turns out that a book is more durable than stone. It's more durable than a castle. It's more durable than an empire. And that's really interesting, that something in some sense so evanescent can be so long-living. So there's that. That's kind of a mystery. I'm approaching this whole scenario, the biblical stories, as if they're a mystery, fundamentally, because they are. There's a lot we don't understand about them. We don't understand how they came about. We don't really understand how they were put together. We don't understand why they had such an unbelievable impact on civilization. We don't understand how people could have believed them. We don't understand what it means that we don't believe them now, or even what it would mean if we did believe them. And then, on top of all that, there's the additional problem, which isn't specific to me, but is certainly relevant to me, that no matter how educated you are, you're not educated enough to discuss the psychological significance of the biblical stories. But I'm going to do my best, and partly because I want to learn more about them. And one of the things I've learned is that the best way to learn about something is to talk about it. And when I'm lecturing, I'm thinking, I'm not trying to tell you what I know for sure to be the case, because there's lots of things I don't know for sure to be the case. I'm trying to make sense out of this, and I have been doing this for a long time.
So right there, you feel this openness to the question and this acknowledgement that what he's doing here has this ability to be considered odd. And there's something intriguing about that. So, like, whether the questions were already there in your mind before he said them, or they were brought out of you as Peterson started probing them, there's something about that that's drawing you in and inviting you into the curiosity. And yeah, there's just something about the recognition of the mystery of these stories and not knowing why they are so powerful. And yeah, trying to use these lectures not to tell you everything he knows, but think through that and come to these understandings himself, because they're heavy questions. You know, I think often when we're listening to people talk about the Bible, it's coming from pulpits and sermons, and there's a lot of confidence in what's being told about the stories, or even on the other end, people trying to discredit it. There's a lot of confidence and sort of an authority of why this thing is not worth listening to. And Peterson just doesn't come with that attitude. And I think that's what is very attractive to people, especially if they are not a part of church, or even have some animosity to it, to kind of open up these biblical stories and the understanding of what might the role be in something grander. So the last clip that gave us a bit of Peterson in his own space without the pressure, but it doesn't kind of answer the question of, okay, why is he doing this? What is the impact? Who's he trying to reach? And to explore that a little bit more, I want to go back to the Vice clip that I played in part 1, because the interviewer asked him that question. So it was interesting to hear his response. So I'll play that for you now.
Who is the target audience? Who are you trying to reach?
Well, partly me, and then partly people who feel that there might be more in them than they're currently manifesting. People who've been fed a nauseating saccharine diet of rights and freedoms for like 50 years with no counterbalance of responsibility. And most people find almost all the genuine meaning in their life in the adoption of responsibility.
So right there, Peterson talks about responsibility, which is a very resonant theme in his work. He sort of hints at what gives him pause with some of these social justice activist movements. And it's not that activists don't talk about responsibility, but I think the target of it is different. Many activists are coming at the idea of responsibility from a more societal level, like what responsibility do we have as a society and a government to challenge the status quo and change the minds of those in dissent, to bend it to the right course of history. And what Peterson's talking about in the idea of responsibility is often more personal responsibility, sort of in biblical terms, the plank in our own eye versus the sawdust in our brother's. I think Peterson's right that in the West we do have a lot of conversation about human rights and freedom and the value we put on those things. And those certainly can bring good to the conversation. And I think he's right in recognizing that we don't take seriously enough the responsibility that comes with freedom and what we deem as human rights and our participation in those things as a society. And I think there is some power in being challenged in our orientation with that. But outside of just this call for responsibility, the way that he does that is very fascinating to me. And there's a piece of this interview a little bit later that I'm going to play that delves a little bit deeper into this.
One of the things that you've talked about is that a lot of times you talk to these young men who are sort of flirting with far-right ideologies, and you try and bring them back. Like, what is that process like? How do you bring someone back from the far right?
Tell them a better story.
What is the better story?
Grow the hell up. Take your place in the world. You've got something to contribute. Make a plan. Live as an individual. Stay away from the identity politics pathology. It's just an excuse for failing to live your life in a respectable and noble manner. It's a way better story than like go wave your idiot far-right flag at some rally with a bunch of pasty-faced morons. What kind of pathetic behavior is that? So it's time to grow the hell up.
So how does Peterson encourage people to take on this responsibility? Well, tell them a better story. As a filmmaker, I obviously think that story is so important and find it so interesting, but just as humans, story is so ingrained in us. I think that emphasis that he has on story is something that has helped him capture the imagination of people and keep them coming back to his work. He isn't just giving people a list of rules to follow or telling them what stories are worth listening to. He himself is exploring the frame of the stories he's personally drawn to, trying to identify the things that stick out to him and re-enchant these narratives. And, hopefully give people eyes to see something that has been lost and that maybe they can adapt in their own life. And when you look at something like 12 Rules of Life, where he is giving rules, how often is he weaving in story to demonstrate that? Whether it's more conventional narratives like ancient myths or the stories he creates through scientific measures like the lobsters. There's something about the way that his interest in story is becoming contagious to others. And then all of a sudden you're opening your mind to trying to understand them better too. Question yourself on how much do I really know this narrative that I've consumed so often, or that I think I know. I don't think you fully get the curiosity of Peterson and story in the Vice clip. If you watch enough Peterson, it seems like there's just something more to loving these stories. He's fascinated by them. He struggles himself to understand this fascination. And he's on the hunt to recognize why they're so memorable. And he doesn't give typical religious answers or blanket statements that tie the complicated nature of stories in a nice little bow and gives us this clear reason of why we find them memorable. He still wrestles with that. And so as a listener and his conversation partners, he's drawing you into that exploration and that intrigue. And all of a sudden you stop being this fly on the wall to a person who goes out and enters the journey themselves of trying to understand why is it that story matters to humans so much, and what they can teach us about the world. But the thing that I find most interesting and probably most powerful about Peterson, and I don't even know if he fully means to do this, but his focus on story and exploration and re-exploration of these things comes with this unspoken appeal for the exploration of the beautiful. Story is almost never just telling truth in a straightforward way. There is an art form to great stories that can't help but put you in contact with something that is beautiful. And whether he's meaning to or not, I think that is one of the things that really is drawing people in and resonating in so many people's lives. It's not just about unpacking these cultural stories that influence us and mining them for deep truth. It's a call to see ourselves in these stories and use that to help reflect and live out a more beautiful story. And to do that, he often suggests that the embrace of suffering and the willingness to work on one's own flaws is the path to capturing that beauty. And he often credits this to religious frameworks. Now, I cannot speak to all religions, but what I can say is that this has been true for me in my understanding of Christianity and Orthodoxy as I learn more about the frame and the Orthodox story. We look to Christ and the pattern of what he did on the cross, voluntarily taking on death in the hopes that that suffering will produce more life. And in that pattern, we see beauty and what it means to be more human. But taking that pattern requires vulnerability and the willingness to look at ourselves, own the places where we put suffering and death out into the world, and do what we can in Petersonian terms to clean our room and reduce that suffering. Now, there's probably a lot more I could dive into about Peterson, but I think that gives us a good frame of Peterson and his non-political work, and it's probably sufficient enough to get back to the Marvel controversy. So given Peterson's love for story, it's sort of fascinating that he has to address this sort of attack through the work of the narrative lens. He probably more than most understands the power that that can have and the complications of addressing this sort of attack in a narrative form. And it's probably not the thing that he wants to do most when he first comes back to the internet. But at this time, a lot of his fans actually came to his aid with defense And instead of doing this in sort of a straightforward way, making a commentary video or an essay or some defense of his work, a lot of people responded in meme form. And I want to play this Freedom Tunes clip to get a sense of the type of memery going on.
Well, if it wasn't Captain America all caught up in my trap.
What kind of sick plot are you hatching?
I'm going to tell kids to clean their rooms and make 5-year plans.
Just like Hitler!
I've already brainwashed my first subject.
I've cleaned my room and repaired my relationship with my father.
No! You're actually kind of helping people. Huh.
Clean your room. Accept your responsibilities. Stop blaming everyone else for your problems.
You're right. I'm gonna clean my room and repair my relationship with my father.
Yeah! Hello? Dad?
So in many ways, I find this type of response very effective. It clearly showcases the disjointedness of the perception of this fictional character that's sort of the embodiment of all evil versus the reality of Jordan Peterson, what he's actually been saying and promoting. And by responding this way, it's basically fighting back in the same terms the allegations were brought. So by leaning into the narrative, flipping it on its head, and sort of making a joke out of the characterization, the viewer's mind sort of opens up and starts to think, oh, maybe there's more to the story. And eventually Peterson and his team responded in a similar vein with creating the Hail Lobster merch and donating the proceeds to charity. Basically taking on the symbolism of the character, flipping it on its head in the hope that they could turn it into something good from something that was not so great. I think this reaction kind of showed the side of Jordan Peterson that is a little more edgy, lighthearted, and enjoys giving people a good poke in the axiom. And as a person who has worked in stand-up and the comedy worlds for several years, I can have appreciation for that. In many ways, humor can be the best way to break down tension and open up the path to better conversation. But like any form of communication, it always has its limits, its strengths, its weaknesses, and one of the ways I think this style of communication really starts to magnify this weakness is when it is used through the frame of Twitter. Now, I don't really use Twitter. It's just never really appealed to me. I think now, especially when I am trying to think through difficult or complicated conversations, they require a lot of nuance and back and forth and trust building, relationship building, to at least have these long-term positive conversations. And I'll just say that I don't think that is always very attainable in 140 characters or less. It certainly has its place in building relationships, but it seems to me more often that when we lean too heavily into Twitter, it often leads to more out-of-context representations, flippant remarks, and witty comebacks that do a lot better job of fueling a fire than calming down outrage. And I just don't think that opens up the door to the best back and forth conversations generally. I think a lot of this has to do with the shortcomings of the forum, but I also think there's a huge part of this that comes from the participation of the person as well. When we're communicating through text, there's a big part of tone that we have a large ability to misunderstand. And there's something just very true about our humanity that when we sit behind a computer, we're much more likely to say something more harshly or more directly, or just something that we wouldn't say in a face-to-face conversation. And how well we do at stopping ourselves from that tendency, and how intentionally we are at working and shaping our use of that and not being so passive with that. I don't know. I just think it changes us to the place where we start to become something we don't want to be without recognizing it fully ourselves. It's just very difficult to navigate. And Peterson seems to have struggled with this navigation as well, and wrestling with these questions as he has taken time back and forth from his participation with Twitter. But where I think this conversation becomes even more relevant to Peterson is that some of the next big controversies he faces involve his ban with Twitter and the way that he expresses political activism on those sites. To keep it short, although this video is not short, but to keep it shorter, Peterson was banned on Twitter for releasing this tweet. And the reason for the ban was because Twitter said it abused its hateful conduct policy. And he would not be able to rejoin Twitter until he deleted this, which he refused to do. Now, at this point, it's probably good to talk about Peterson's choice to join the Daily Wire network, because I think the move ultimately increased the tension of this issue and a lot of the other issues surrounding him, particularly in the political frame. So about a year ago, Peterson and Daily Wire announced that they were partnering for their Daily Wire Plus platform. And there were several videos released around this partnership, but Peterson released this video on why he chose to make this change. Some of his reasoning being, the capitalistic nature of the company, having more resources to do things he wanted to do, and not being independent and doing all of this on his own. He wanted that team and support. But one thing that he specifically mentioned directly referenced the Twitter ban. So I'll play that clip for you if I can, where he addresses it.
Fourth, it was prudent to protect myself and the intellectual property I have produced and will continue to produce. I was just banned from Twitter, synchronistically, so to speak, the same day I partnered with the Daily Wire. YouTube and I are getting along, for now, although their lack of transparency on the algorithm front is worrisome. But God only knows when I will say something that the invisible powers that be, including some that are artificially intelligent in nature, will decide that they've heard enough from the reprehensible magic super Nazi. There are more reasons, but that's a good start.
So I remember when Peterson announced his joining of Daily Wire. And I remember it gave a lot of people mixed feelings. I think particularly in Estuary circles. I saw some people loving it. Other people were claiming it's the darkest timeline. And, a lot more somewhere in the messy middle. And I've seen my fair share of Daily Wire content. So when it came to the announcement of Peterson, I can understand why many had their reservations with it. Yet, for me, it didn't come as much of a surprise. As he got more exposure through the years, it always felt like Peterson was being pulled more into political conversations. And the way that I saw it with him, it's almost like he felt like it was his responsibility to take on the suffering of that conversation, to reduce it for others. So, I looked around and, listened to what Peterson wanted and thought, okay, where else is he going to go? And, there was enough continuity in both of their missions that I figured, they could probably find a way to work together. It might be a good move for both parties. But on the other hand, you look at the tone that he had in the promo and the stronger political frame and sort of the culture war frame that Peterson was taking on. And it felt like, maybe he's let a little resentment come in. Like I said before, it seemed like Peterson always danced with the culture war stuff. So, when he joins Daily Wire, who has positioned itself as a frontline force in the culture war, it seemed like he stopped playing in the sandbox or sharing the sandbox and, dancing with this line to a full embrace of a team to sort of fight an enemy. I recognize why that creates a bit of mixed emotion and uncertainty about Peterson's attitude toward the conversation and what that would mean for his work going forward. There was this worry about this loss of curiosity of people and stories and exploration in that way, but I also think there was a worry that the change was not only directed at his attitude, but towards the higher production quality as well. The minute you put a camera in anything, it totally changes it changes the behavior of people. And the higher quality you get, the more ability you have to change something. Like the setting and the frame that you put people in has a way to change that psychology. So having very slick, high production quality, it might take away from this rugged sort of perception Peterson had made himself, where he's sitting in front of a computer having conversations with people he found interesting, or in a lecture hall talking about biblical stories. There was always that worry that that character would change the dynamic as well. Sometimes those choices just matter more than we think, and it would only really reveal itself as time went on. And, at the beginning, it didn't look great. The first few videos that came out that were clearly produced by Daily Wire covered some of these topics, like the Twitter ban and other controversial issues. And people felt like there was something off with them. For one, the slicker production, it definitely gave a different feel to the way Peterson presented himself, and came across. It sort of felt robotic and scripted, and for a lot of people it was off-putting. And then outside of all the production changes, the attitude and the anger came out from Peterson, and that felt a bit out of place too. Chad the Alcoholic actually made a meme video about one of these videos that I thought was really funny, and I think expressed the way that many viewed this new version of Peterson that was coming from Daily Wire. So I'll play that now, and then I want to talk about it a little bit.
I just want you to know how... I just want you to know how sorry we are that things got so fucked up with us and Mr. Wallace. We got into this thing with the best intentions, really. I never...
Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who. Twitter's a rat hole in the final analysis.
So I think this video just really brilliantly expresses the way that many of us fans perceived the reaction that Peterson had in those videos, not as using minimal force in the conversation, but stepping over the line and pushing things to the extremes. And the indulgence and the outrage was creating something a bit distasteful. And there was a lot of questions of how helpful is this to the conversation and the navigation of these controversial issues, which I think is what Estuary has been more focused on. Certainly there's a lot of people talking about ideas in this circle, and there are times we're working together to come to better answers to questions and even navigating our own little scuffles. But I think we more often are working on how to do that without losing the humanity of a person. How do we check ourselves so we don't fall into that outrage cycle, and we listen to the things we don't agree with, and not placate it, but try to understand it and the perspective and how it can shape us and grow us. And how do we embed that in our own stories, even if at the end of the day we're coming to different conclusions? And how does the things we believe tie into the way we live and keep us from falling into that them against us mentality as we try to figure out what it is to live meaningfully? Well, I think there's probably an argument to be made that the people coming after Peterson about the Twitter were not as apologetic as the pop fiction clip showed. The criticism is still valid in pointing out that this sort of response from Peterson to these attacks was being perceived, and how it might be distracting to the spirit of the conversation and the spirit that he brought in to those early moments that gave people a hope for a less contentious conversation. And I think there'll always be a little bit of that uncertainty as this partnership with Daily Wire continues. Man, it feels like Estuary has a very interesting relationship with culture war. In some ways, it feels like it was formed because of it. And not to say that there aren't people in Estuary who feel part of the culture war, have that sort of mindset. But Estuary felt like a response to it, or some sort of pushback to what we were seeing in the culture war. And not in a way that's sort of activist mindset of trying to shut it down or destroy it, but just sort of a disenchantment and rejection of that mode of interaction, and the recognition that, maybe there is some good from it, but, after a while it could have diminishing returns. And, you're just getting tired of that interaction, and it didn't feel like it was providing the most helpful conversations or the most interesting conversations. And I just don't think it ended up creating the most effective space to think through ideas and challenge your own beliefs. And I definitely don't think it's the most effective space to think through controversial issues on either side of the aisle, whether you're looking at the culture war from the right or the left. Now, for me, having Peterson join Daily Wire, I don't necessarily think is something we should judge so strongly. I don't think it's fair to fully say that because someone decides to work for or partner with a company, that it therefore means they agree with and stand for everything the company does, or every person who works for that company has said. That's just such a high bar that nobody can live up to. And I also think it doesn't really get to the complications of what it is like to navigate a situation that Peterson finds himself in. But something that we can sort of look at with this is that the people you spend the most time with change who you are. And you become much more like the people who you allow to influence you. And so by working with a company that has much more of a culture war emphasis, that many of their talk show hosts are more willing to get into the outrage culture space, that can be contagious, and it can affect the way that you act and what you see as the right path forward. And I do think it has affected Peterson and the way that he acts and creates. And I guess what it opens me up to is the question of, well, Estuary has been so affected by Peterson. What could this mean for this community? Is it open to that sort of contagion too? I've been pretty involved personally with Estuary and advocated for it quite strongly, because I do think that there is this distinction in the mode in which that operates in this space versus anything other that I've seen floating around the internet. It wasn't just about spinning ideas and getting everything in order and align and, standing on the right side of history. It was focused on meeting people where they were at and learning from them and their stories. It was more than just sitting in an armchair and coming to true answers about questions. There was this inspiration from each other to ground ourselves in life and find a way to let these ideas that pop around the internet and float around in our heads integrate into real life community. It's more of a trust exercise than a means to an end of finding all of the right answers. And as time has gone on, it does feel like we've lost some of that curiosity and exploration, and that spirit that distinguishes it from other places. And maybe that's just inevitable. I think the longer something lives online, it's hard to avoid that infectious outrage culture and that desire for black and white certainty for answers. It's very human. I don't know, there's just so much confusion on how to engage well with the right spirit in things. How do we take these frustrations we feel by the things that we see in the world and engage in the right spirit and channel those frustrations in a healthy way? Not just for ourselves, but for the people around us. But it becomes especially difficult when you're inhabiting places where there's not good trust, spaces where it's very easy to lose sight of the complicated nature of what it is to be human, and losing sight of the beauty of what it is to discover that. And part of that's showing yourself and being vulnerable and trying to let yourself be seen in the situation and act as well as you can. Sometimes that means giving grace to someone else who would respond in a way that you never would. And more importantly, a lot of that requires you being willing to ask for grace yourself, because we all make mistakes and faults as we're trying to figure out this thing. It's been a while since all the Twitter drama played out, and Peterson has since been reinstated to Twitter and continues to create and face controversies. And after a year of being Daily Wire, to me, it doesn't seem like Peterson has dove so far in the deep end that he's lost that thing that was interesting to those who were not so interested in the political. The political has definitely become more present in his work, and I do think the partnership has changed him a bit, but I don't think it's changed as much as people feared. And even in the face of all of that, what I find the most interesting about Peterson is the moments where we get true vulnerability from him. And he shakes away from this sort of online persona he's created. And you get a glimpse of that human aspect behind the public figure. And I went through a lot of different things trying to uncover Peterson, and I stumbled across this video of Peterson on Michaela's podcast where he's speaking with Africa Brooke, who shared her story about how she went from a person who, despite Peterson, wouldn't listen to anything, to being very inspired and changed by his work. And the whole video is a very interesting dynamic to watch. But to kind of close off, I want to watch this piece of the conversation. And I want to watch this piece because I think it gives a more human version of Peterson. And it adds something as we factor in the sort of culture war personality that seems to have taken shape over the year.
I finally allowed myself to be curious again. And now, Jordan, I can say you have been one of the most influential people to me for so many reasons I couldn't even mention right now. But to be able to have the conversations that I do now publicly, you have, and I could have never imagined this ever in my entire life. Things like this don't just happen. And the fact that I can tell you this.
Oh no.
Thank you. Just thank you.
It's a pleasure. It's a rough pleasure, but
I know.
You know, you knew what happened to me with Marvel Comics?
Yeah.
That was something. It's really something to see yourself portrayed. You know, I got accused of being a Nazi pretty much when all this happened. It was really something because I had been teaching students what we're talking about today, about these temptations that you faced and how people, as individuals, get sucked into that totalitarian hell. You know, and then, so that was something for that to happen, such a reversal. And then to have that comic book come out, well, it was surreal. It was absolutely surreal to be portrayed, because Nazi wasn't enough, right? We had to go right for the archetype itself. So I think we've raised about $400,000 for charity now on the basis of that. So that was a fun reversal. But it was really shocking when I first saw that. I just couldn't believe it. I was very ill at the time too. And I thought, this can't be real. This has to be Photoshopped. This cannot possibly be happening. It's so completely beyond comprehension. And, you know, to come from the pen of one of the foremost Black intellectuals, and I use the racial category only because that's the categories that he's using to operate within.
Yeah.
You know? So
life is really weird.
This is true.
Right.
If Estuary's taught me anything, I think it's the power of listening to people's stories and understanding how much that shapes them and how it got them to the places that they're at. And in this clip, you see the pain and toil and the things that took Peterson to where he is and what he's doing now. And what I think it ultimately opened up in me to recognize is that even if I'm not a fan of some of the ways that he fights back or communicates, I can empathize with the pressure that got him there and realize the complexity of what it is being thrown into a situation like that and the humanity of dealing with something like that. And, it's always going to inevitably lead to responding in a way that somebody will not agree with. I guess to wrap this all up, this very long video up, is sort of bringing it back to Estuary. And what I think is really great about it is that it isn't solely relying on one central figure. It's been promoted and inspired by a lot of different people, but it's something that exists in a bit of a network. And so you can kind of adopt this sort of AA model of thinking where you take what's helpful and you leave what isn't. And I think Peterson is a really good practice in that sort of way of thinking. You can't get away from the way that he's influenced the space, but it isn't the end all be all of what this is. And I guess we just keep watching and weighing and wrestling with the personalities we find helpful and leave what isn't, and let that process guide us in the way we engage with each other. And it's always going to take time to figure out. But, hopefully we can all discover better ways to do that. And I'm just excited to see how everything will shape out. So that's all I have for now. Thank you for sticking it out this long and listening, and I'll see you in the next video.